After my stroke, I gave my cherished home to my son. He promised I'd always have a place. 2 weeks later, my place was the windowless pantry. My beloved treasures gone. I simply nodded. But a quiet resolve settled within me. You see, I had a plan, and it was just beginning. Like, share, and tell me where you're listening from. Eleanor, at 72, had always prided herself on her resilience. A widow for 2 decades, she had maintained the sprawling Victorian house on Sycamore Lane with meticulous care and unwavering affection. Every creaking floorboard, every intricate stained glass panel, every rose in the sprawling garden held a story, a memory, a piece of her heart. Then came the minor stroke, a subtle tremor that shook her world more profoundly than its doctors understood. It was not severe enough to incapacitate her entirely, but it left her feeling vulnerable, a little unsteady on her feet, and, for the first time in her life, acutely aware of her own mortality. It was this vulnerability that prompted her decision, one she believed was born of practicality and love, to transfer ownership of her beloved home to her only son, Daniel, and his wife, Sophia. She imagined a future where she would live out her days in the familiar comfort of her home, surrounded by her family, free from the burdens of maintenance. The day of the transfer was a blur of legal papers and forced smiles. Daniel, a kind man at heart though often easily swayed, had squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes earnest. "You'll always have a place here, Mom," he had assured her, his voice thick with what she perceived as genuine affection. "This is your home. Always." Sophia, however, stood a little apart, a tight, polite smile plastered on her face that never quite reached her shrewd, calculating eyes. Eleanor, ever perceptive, felt a faint chill, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious symphony of family gratitude. She chose to dismiss it then, attributing it to Sophia's natural reserve, or perhaps just her own post-stroke anxiety. A memory stirred, a conversation with her dear friend, Arthur Davies, a sharp-witted attorney who had handled her late husband's estate. "Eleanor," Arthur had said, his voice firm over the phone weeks earlier, "are you certain about this outright transfer? Even with family, it's wise to protect yourself." He had insisted, with his characteristic professional diligence, on adding a specific protective clause to the deed. It wasn't about distrust, he'd argued, but about prudence, ensuring her lifelong right to residency and certain privileges within the property. At the time, Eleanor had thought it excessive, a slight against Daniel and Sophia, but Arthur's insistence had prevailed. Now, a tiny, almost imperceptible knot of comfort formed in her chest as she remembered his sagacity. The first 2 weeks following the transfer were deceptively normal. Then, one Tuesday morning, Sophia approached Eleanor with an unnervingly cheerful demeanor. "Mom, we've decided to make some changes," she announced, her voice bright, almost too bright. "The master bedroom, it's just so much space for one person now. We think it's time for you to move to a cozier, more manageable room." Eleanor's heart gave a jolt. Before she could articulate a question, Sophia was already leading her towards the back of the house, to what had once been the capacious butler's pantry. It was a small, windowless chamber, traditionally used for storing fine china and dry goods. Now it had been painted a stark, sterile white, and in its center stood a small twin bed, draped with a cheap floral duvet Eleanor had never seen before. Sophia gestured broadly to the tiny, confined space. "We fixed it up for you," she declared, beaming, as if presenting a lavish suite. "It's perfect for your needs." Daniel appeared in the doorway, his eyes darting away from hers, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "The guest rooms," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze entirely. "They're being converted for the kids. They need more space now that they're growing." Eleanor looked around the minuscule room, her mind struggling to process the abruptness, the sheer audacity of it all. This was not cozier, this was a cupboard. Her entire life, condensed into a 12 by 8-foot box. The room itself was a study in clinical impersonality. The fresh white paint failed to mask the faint, lingering smell of onions and root vegetables that had permeated the walls over decades. Above the bed, a single, harsh fluorescent light hummed, casting a cold, unforgiving glow that made the pristine white walls seem even more barren. There was no window, no natural light to soften the edges. No familiar warmth. It felt less like a bedroom, and more like an interrogation chamber. A place to be contained, not comforted. Sophia, ever efficient, checked her watch with a performative flourish. "Oh, look at the time. We have that dinner reservation. Daniel, darling, we must fly." She offered Eleanor another tight, fleeting smile, then swept out of the room, Daniel trailing silently in her wake. Eleanor was left standing alone, surrounded by a few hastily moved boxes and a handful of her most personal items, which seemed to shrink in the overwhelming emptiness of her new, tiny reality. Her once grand, elegant bedroom, the sanctuary of her later years, was now just a distant memory. That night, Eleanor lay rigid on the unfamiliar twin bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her own house. The distant murmur of the television from the living room, the clinking of dishes being put away, the low hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen, all sounds she had known intimately for over 50 years. Yet now they resonated differently, filtered through the thin, insubstantial walls of her confinement. She was an outsider, an eavesdropper in her own home. Reduced to a whisper, she tried to adjust, to find some comfort in the sterile space, but it was futile. The harsh fluorescent light distorted the vibrant colors of her watercolor paintings, transforming her cherished landscapes into bleak, washed-out shadows. Her favorite handmade quilt, a gift from her grandmother, was nowhere to be found. "My quilt." She ventured the next morning during a brief, strained encounter with Sophia. "And I could really use a reading lamp in my room." Sophia shrugged, her gaze dismissive. "Oh, those old things? We cleared them out. They were taking up so much space, Mom. We donated a lot of your older items for decluttering. It was time for a fresh start." It wasn't just the quilt. Eleanor noticed her collection of handcrafted pottery, each piece imbued with sentimental value, and her delicate vintage teacups, heirlooms passed down through generations, had vanished from the display cabinet in the dining room. When she inquired, Daniel mumbled, "Sophia thought they were taking up too much space. We needed to simplify." The words, though delivered by Daniel, carried Sophia's cold, pragmatic tone. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his discomfort palpable. One evening, Eleanor was making her way to the kitchen for a glass of water when she overheard Sophia's voice, hushed but distinct, from Daniel's study. The door was slightly ajar. "Honestly, Daniel, she's like a ghost haunting the place," Sophia whispered, a note of exasperation in her tone. "Always underfoot. The pantry works for now. It keeps her out of the way, doesn't it?" Eleanor froze, the glass slipping slightly in her trembling hand. The words were a physical blow, stripping away any last vestiges of illusion. She wasn't family anymore. She was an inconvenience, a spectral presence to be contained and ignored. Back in her tiny room, Eleanor collapsed onto the unfamiliar twin bed, silent tears tracing paths through the dust of betrayal on her cheeks. She cried into the coarse, unfamiliar pillow, the truth of her situation sinking in like a heavy stone. Her son, her only child, had allowed this. He had stood by, silent and complicit, as his wife systematically erased her from her own life, from her own home. The tears were not just for her lost comfort or her stolen possessions. They were for the shattering of a lifelong dream, a mother's belief in her son's unwavering love. The next morning, Eleanor descended to a breakfast table, where the silence was as thick and tangible as the tension. Daniel buried his face in his newspaper. Sophia chatted brightly about her plans for the day, pointedly excluding Eleanor from the conversation. She was merely tolerated, a presence to be navigated around, certainly not engaged with. As she quietly buttered a piece of toast, a flicker of defiance, cold and sharp, ignited within her. And then, like a lighthouse beam cutting through a dense fog, Arthur Davies's words echoed in her mind. A protective clause. The forgotten safety net. A ghost, Sophia had called her. Perhaps. But even ghosts could exact their own kind of haunting. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. A faint, almost imperceptible curve playing on her lips. The days blurred into weeks, each one bringing another subtle, yet significant, erasure of Eleanor's presence from the very fabric of her home. It was a slow, deliberate chipping away, not just of her belongings, but of her very identity within those familiar walls. She watched, a silent observer from the confines of her pantry room, as the house she had nurtured and loved for half a century shed its layers of her history. First, it was the art. Her vibrant watercolor paintings, scenes from her travels with William, portraits of family, or quiet landscapes from her own garden, were systematically taken down. In their place appeared an assortment of generic, mass-produced prints. A serene beach at sunset, a bustling cityscape at night, abstract shapes in muted tones. They were pretty enough, Eleanor supposed, but utterly devoid of soul, a stark contrast to the lively brushstrokes that had once adorned the walls. Each time she saw a space where one of her paintings had hung, now filled with a stranger's art, she felt a quiet ache, a part of her spirit being painted over. Then came the grander disappearances. The antique grandfather clock, a majestic sentinel that had stood in the main hallway since her wedding day, its steady tick-tock, a comforting heartbeat of the house, was gone. Its absence left a gaping hole, not just in the decor, but in the silence that now settled over the house. When Eleanor finally gathered the courage to ask Daniel about it, he merely shrugged, barely meeting her eyes. "We sold it, Mom," he admitted, a note of dismissiveness in his voice. Sophia thought it didn't really fit with the new aesthetic. Eleanor nodded, the familiar pang of disappointment settling in her chest. She wanted to ask, to scream, when did my home, my history, become merely an aesthetic? When did the cherished memories and heirlooms of her life become disposable decorative elements to be sold off for a new look? But she remained silent, a silent witness to her own gradual disappearance. The greatest blow, however, came with the garden. Her garden. The one she had cultivated since she and William first moved into the house. A riot of color and fragrance that shifted with the seasons. Roses, their velvety petals bursting in summer, hydrangeas in blues and purples, a fragrant corner dedicated to herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, whose scents had mingled with the morning dew. This garden had been her solace, her canvas, her connection to William after his passing. She would spend hours there, tending to each plant, feeling his presence in the warmth of the sun and the whisper of the breeze through the leaves. One morning, the familiar roar of machinery shattered the quiet. Peeking cautiously from her pantry door, she saw a crew of landscapers, armed with shovels and heavy equipment, systematically ripping out every living thing. The vibrant tapestry of her life's work was torn apart, reduced to barren earth. By evening, it was done. Her beloved haven was replaced with stark, geometric beds filled with a scattering of rocks and a few stiff, uninteresting shrubs. Low-maintenance landscaping, Sophia had announced that evening, her tone brimming with self-satisfaction. And honestly, Eleanor, she continued, her voice losing its edge of false kindness, you weren't able to maintain it properly anymore. It was becoming an eyesore. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight, another irreparable crack spreading through her heart. An eyesore. Her beautiful, vibrant garden, her solace, deemed an eyesore. The pain was sharp, almost physical. She retreated to her room, the emptiness of the garden mirroring the emptiness she felt inside. Later that week, while carefully navigating the kitchen for a rare glass of water, she spotted a familiar pot in the trash bin, half buried beneath discarded packaging. Her Boston fern, a gift from William 15 years ago, its fronds a lush, vibrant green, testament to her diligent care. It lay there, broken and wilting, deemed trash. A quiet fire ignited within Eleanor. Without a word, she carefully lifted the pot, cradling the damaged plant in her arms. Back in her pantry, she gave it a drink, gently pruned its broken fronds, and placed it on the small stool by her bed, the only sliver of green in her sterile white box. "We'll survive this, won't we?" she whispered to the fern, a promise to both herself and the ailing plant. Her isolation deepened with each passing day. The sounds of laughter and conversation often drifted from the living room, particularly when Sophia hosted her friends. Eleanor would hear the clinking of glasses, the lively chatter, the occasional burst of genuine mirth, all from the echoing silence of her small room. She was so close, yet entirely excluded. Sophia often made a point of announcing loudly, for the benefit of her guests, "Mom's not feeling well today. The doctor says we need to keep her quiet." There was no doctor, no illness beyond a broken heart, but the lie served its purpose, justifying Eleanor's enforced solitude. One afternoon, the voices carried clearly through the thin walls. Sophia was talking to her friend, Brenda. "It's such a burden, Brenda. You wouldn't believe." Sophia sighed dramatically. "Honestly, it's like having another child, only this one's a very demanding, very outdated child." Eleanor's breath hitched. Outdated. She was a relic, a burden, a thing to be tolerated. "Well, you know," Brenda's voice suggested, "there are some lovely homes these days, places with all the amenities." Sophia's reply was chillingly casual. "Oh, not yet. We're not quite there. A year should be enough, I think. Then we'll say her health declined suddenly. No one will question it." Eleanor sat frozen on her twin bed, the words echoing in her mind. "A year. We'll say her health declined suddenly. They were planning to dispose of her. Not just her belongings, not just her history, but her." A cold, creeping terror seeped into her bones, quickly followed by a fierce, protective resolve. Adding to her pain, her beloved grandchildren, Lily, 10, and Oscar, 8, were kept away. They used to burst into her room with tales of school and games, eager for her stories and gentle hugs. Now, Sophia would intercept them, her voice sweet but firm. "No, darlings. Grandma needs her rest today. The doctor says we mustn't bother her." The children, innocent and compliant, would nod, their bright faces dimming slightly before being led away. Eleanor yearned for their touch, their uncomplicated love, but even that was being systematically denied. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor pulled out a small, worn photo album from one of her hastily packed boxes. She flipped through the pages until she found a faded photograph of Daniel as a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, his arm thrown around her neck, a wide, joyful grin on his face. She traced his youthful image with a trembling finger, a profound sadness washing over her. Where had that loving child gone? What had transformed him into the passive observer of her silent erasure, the silent accomplice in her impending abandonment? The slow, grinding erosion of Eleanor's spirit continued for weeks, marked by the ever-increasing silence and the growing distance from her family. Then, one Saturday morning, a small, hopeful crack appeared in the wall of her isolation. The pantry door creaked open, and Oscar, her 8-year-old grandson, slipped in, a mischievous glint in his eyes, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Grandma?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine confusion. "Why do you live in the pantry now?" Eleanor's heart fluttered with a mix of joy and sorrow at the unexpected visit. She pulled him close, inhaling the scent of sunshine and boyish energy. "Well, sweet pea," she began, trying to keep her voice light. "It's a bit complicated for grown-ups to explain." Oscar, however, was not easily satisfied. He looked up at her, his innocent gaze piercing through her carefully constructed composure. "Dad said, it's because you're old. But Mrs. Henderson, from next door, she's older than you. And she lives in a real room." not a pantry. His simple logic laid bare the absurdity, the cruelty of her situation. It was a child's unfiltered truth, delivered with the sting of an unblinking honesty. Eleanor hugged him tighter, burying her face in his soft hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are hard to understand, sweetie," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. "But I'm okay. Really, I am." It was a lie, but one she told for his sake, to shield him from the harsh realities of adult betrayals. Oscar pulled back slightly, his expression still doubtful. "Mom says we shouldn't come in here because it's depressing," he said, repeating Sophia's words with a child's artless mimicry. The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Just then, Sophia's voice, sharp and laced with irritation, cut through the quiet. "Oscar! What did I tell you about disturbing Grandma?" She appeared in the doorway, her face tight with a familiar displeasure, her eyes narrowing as they swept over Eleanor. She strode in, her hand firm on Oscar's arm, pulling him away from Eleanor's embrace. "Honestly, Jacob, you have no respect for boundaries." She always used his formal name when she was truly annoyed, and the slip of calling him Jacob in front of Eleanor felt like an intentional jab, as if Eleanor was too inconsequential to remember the familiar name they all used. Sophia then turned her cold smile towards Eleanor, a smile that conveyed anything but warmth. "Sorry, Eleanor. You know how kids are. No boundaries." The implication was clear. Eleanor was the one allowing the breach, the one failing to enforce the distance Sophia desired. Eleanor sat back on her twin bed, her hands trembling, the warmth of Oscar's small body still lingering. Depressing. The word echoed in her mind. Branding her. Had she truly become a source of shame? A depressing secret to be hidden away? The thought was a fresh wound, a confirmation of Sophia's malicious intent. That night, the thin walls of her pantry room once again failed to provide privacy. Eleanor overheard Daniel and Sophia arguing, their voices muffled but distinct, from the dining room. The subject, unmistakably, was her. "I don't understand why she can't join us for dinner anymore, Sophia." Daniel's voice was tinged with a rare frustration, a flicker of the son she once knew. "She's my mother." Sophia's retort was swift and sharp, laced with a familiar exasperation. "Because Daniel, she criticizes everything. Every meal I make. Every choice I make for this house. I can't take her constant judgment." Eleanor listened, a profound sense of injustice rising within her. Criticize? She hadn't offered a single critical word in months. After the initial shock of her displacement, she had retreated into herself, carefully monitoring every word, every expression, every move. She had become afraid to speak, afraid to voice an opinion, for fear of further ostracization. Her silence, apparently, was still interpreted as judgment. Daniel's voice softened then, a familiar pattern, the hint of resistance in him quickly weakening. "She's just old-fashioned, honey. She'll adjust." Sophia scoffed, a brittle sound. "Adjust? It's been months, Daniel. And she still looks at me like I've stolen something from her. Can't you see it in her eyes?" A bitter, unbidden thought surged through Eleanor's mind. Haven't you? Haven't you stolen my home, my dignity, my peace of mind, my relationship with my own son and grandchildren?" The truth of it was stark, undeniable. Sophia had indeed stolen from her, piece by agonizing piece, until Eleanor felt hollowed out, a mere shell, inhabiting a small white box. The argument faded into muffled discontent, leaving Eleanor in the quiet aftermath, the full weight of her stolen life pressing down on her. Her hands, still trembling slightly, brushed against a small embossed card tucked into the pocket of her faded cardigan. It was Arthur Davies's business card, a relic from a time when she thought herself secure, protected. The protective clause. Arthur's firm, sagacious voice echoed in her memory once more. It was no longer a question of if, but when. It was time. It was well past time. She would call Arthur in the morning. For weeks, Eleanor had made herself scarce, a self-imposed exile driven by a gnawing shame. She couldn't bear the thought of her neighbors, the familiar faces of Sycamore Lane, seeing her reduced circumstances, knowing she lived in a pantry. Each time she ventured out for a quick, furtive trip to the grocery store, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, feeling like a ghost haunting her own past. But on a crisp autumn morning, as she tentatively stepped onto her porch to retrieve the newspaper, a voice cut through her careful anonymity. "Eleanor! Is that really you?" Her neighbor of 30 years, Beatrice Albright, stood across the street, watering her vibrant window boxes. Beatrice, at 80, was a force of nature, her silver hair styled in an impeccable bob, her eyes sharp and knowing, missing nothing. She put down her watering can and, with a briskness that belied her age, crossed the street. "I haven't seen you in weeks," Beatrice declared, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor with a frankly assessing air. "You're thin. And pale. Like you haven't seen the sun in months." Her words, though blunt, held no malice, only concern. Eleanor attempted a weak, unconvincing smile. "Just adjusting to the new arrangement." "Beatrice," she mumbled, trying to sound nonchalant, as if her banishment to the pantry was a deliberate lifestyle choice. Beatrice's eyes, however, narrowed. She wasn't easily fooled. "New arrangement?" she repeated, a hint of steel in her voice. "You mean being banished to that back room while Sophia redecorates your house in that ridiculous modern style? All cold steel and beige. No character whatsoever." Eleanor was stunned. The directness of Beatrice's words, the fact that she knew, left her speechless. How could she possibly know? Beatrice sighed, a sound of weary wisdom. "I came by last week, left a casserole." Sophia answered the door. Said she barely recognized the place. Said it like you'd been erased. She paused, her gaze softening. "I recognized it, though." "Eleanor." "What they've done." Tears, hot and stinging, welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring Beatrice's kind face. The dam she had so carefully constructed around her emotions began to crack. Beatrice, without a word, simply took her arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Come on," she said gently. "Come have tea with me." I made scones. In Beatrice's sunny kitchen, warm with the scent of freshly brewed tea and baking, Eleanor finally let go. The room was a comforting clutter of mismatched teacups, cheerful ceramic plates, and a vibrant collection of houseplants, a stark contrast to the sterile white box she now inhabited. Each teacup on Beatrice's shelf reminded Eleanor of her own lost collection, the handcrafted pottery Daniel had dismissed. Surrounded by this comforting familiarity, Eleanor poured out her story, the words tumbling out in a rush, detailing the forced move, the stolen possessions, the subtle cruelties, the chilling conversation she'd overheard. Beatrice listened patiently, her expression grave, occasionally interjecting with a hum of understanding. When Eleanor finally finished, exhausted and emotionally raw, Beatrice looked at her directly, her gaze unwavering. "Eleanor," she declared, her voice devoid of pity, filled instead with a fierce resolve. "You know what this is, don't you? This is elder abuse. Financial and emotional, and you are letting them do it." Eleanor flinched, the words raw and painful. "But Daniel is my son," she whispered, as if that fact alone should render the accusations impossible. Beatrice scoffed gently. "And that, Eleanor, gives him the right to treat you like an inconvenient houseplant? To discard you like a broken piece of furniture? Is that the son you raised?" Her words were a stinging rebuke. But they also held an undeniable truth. Then, Beatrice's voice softened slightly, a hint of the old, spirited Eleanor shining through her memory. "You were an art teacher for 30 years, Eleanor. You taught children to see beauty, to value themselves, to stand up for what's right. You were fierce, independent, full of life. When did you become this doormat? The question hung in the air, a challenge that resonated deep within Eleanor. When indeed? The thought sparked a flicker of the old fire, a dormant ember stirring to life. That very afternoon, Beatrice, with characteristic decisiveness, ushered Eleanor out the door. "You're coming with me," she announced. "Time you met the Grey Rebellion." She led Eleanor down the street to the local park, where a small group of women, all with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes, were already gathering. Margaret, Carol, Susan, Beatrice introduced them with a flourish. "This is Eleanor. She's just joined the ranks." The women greeted her with warm, knowing smiles. "The Grey Rebellion," Carol winked. "Sounds a bit more dignified than the Angry Old Ladies Club, wouldn't you say?" Eleanor, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, let out a genuine laugh, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful in its release. The conversation that followed was a revelation. These women, like her, had faced their own battles against societal invisibility, against the subtle, and not so subtle, disrespect that often accompanied aging. Margaret, a statuesque woman with a twinkle in her eye, shared her own experience with a son who had attempted to control her finances. "Changed my bank, changed my will, changed my locks," she recounted with a satisfied smirk. "Then I took a cruise. Best decision I ever made." Carol, a petite woman with an unexpectedly strong voice, chimed in. "Knowledge is power, Eleanor. Don't ever forget that." Her words resonated deeply with Eleanor, bringing to mind the lawyer, Arthur Davies, and the business card now clutched tightly in her pocket. The protective clause. A weapon she had forgotten she possessed. The seed of a plan, a rebellion of her own, began to take root in Eleanor's heart. The flicker of defiance ignited by Beatrice and her Grey Rebellion was about to be fanned into a roaring flame. If you're finding Eleanor's story resonates with you, or if you're cheering her on, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing so you don't miss how she fights back. Your support means the world. The very next morning, the budding sense of empowerment Eleanor felt after her conversation with Beatrice was put to an immediate, brutal test. She and Beatrice had enjoyed a brisk walk around the block, the autumn air invigorating, a welcome respite from the stale confines of her pantry room. As they rounded the corner onto Sycamore Lane, a large moving truck, emblazoned with the logo of a local consignment shop, was parked in her driveway. A cold dread gripped Eleanor's stomach. Her eyes instantly scanned the scene, and her heart sank. Two burly men were carefully, yet impersonally, carrying out pieces of furniture from her house. There, unmistakable, was her grandmother's antique writing desk, its mahogany gleam dulled by the morning light, its delicate brass pulls catching a glint of the Sunday. Following close behind, carefully maneuvered through the front door, was William's refinished armoire, a labor of love he had painstakingly restored in his workshop, its rich cherry wood glowing. These weren't just objects. They were silent storytellers, keepers of generations of memories, and now they were being carted away like discarded junk. "What's happening?" Eleanor demanded, her voice, surprisingly, coming out stronger and clearer than she expected. Daniel, who had been directing the movers from the porch, started, clearly surprised by her sudden appearance. His eyes widened slightly, a flash of guilt flickering across his face. "Mom," he stammered, recovering quickly. "You're early from your walk." He cleared his throat. "We're just updating the guest room. These pieces don't really fit the new design, you know." He gestured vaguely at the empty space in the foyer. "Those aren't just pieces," Eleanor retorted, her voice firm, the new resolve she'd found solidifying with each word. "That's my history. That desk belonged to my grandmother, and that armoire," she pointed to the cherry wood being carefully strapped onto the truck, "your father made that. He spent months on it." Daniel looked down, momentarily ashamed, but then his jaw hardened, a reflection of Sophia's unyielding determination. "It's not practical anymore, Mom," he said, his voice tinged with the familiar, dismissive tone. "We need to move forward. Modernize." "Move forward to where?" Eleanor pressed, refusing to back down. "Where is all of this going, Daniel?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The consignment shop on Maple Street," he admitted, his gaze still avoiding hers. "We figured someone else could appreciate them." Later that evening, the chill of the autumn air matched the chill in Eleanor's heart as she stood before the brightly lit window of the consignment shop on Maple Street. There they were, her grandmother's desk, William's armoire, and several other smaller items she now recognized from her home, all adorned with stark, white price tags. They were no longer cherished heirlooms, imbued with stories and love. They were merely vintage finds, reduced to commodities, stripped of their soul and waiting for a stranger to buy them. It felt like watching fragments of her own life being sold off, piece by agonizing piece. As she stood there, a profound sense of violation washing over her, Eleanor pulled out her phone. Her fingers, no longer trembling, went directly to Arthur Davies's business card, which she had carefully placed in her contacts. The time for deliberation was over. It was time to understand that clause, to finally use the protection Arthur had so wisely insisted upon. Arthur's office was quiet, smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. He greeted her with a warm, knowing smile. "Eleanor," he said, ushering her to a comfortable leather chair. "I wondered when I'd be seeing you." He didn't ask why, didn't feign surprise. He simply pulled her file from a cabinet, a testament to his foresight. He placed the thick deed in front of her, turning to a specific page. "You remember we discussed this, Eleanor," he said, his finger tapping a paragraph. "Section 4, paragraph C, of the deed. This is your protective clause," he read aloud, his voice steady and clear. "In the event that the grantor, Eleanor Margaret Vance, is subject to neglect, mistreatment, or unsuitable living conditions on the property, 14 Sycamore Lane, the grantor reserves the right to revoke the property transfer and reclaim full ownership of said property." He looked up at her, his expression serious. "It's legally binding, Eleanor." And Daniel signed it. A wave of relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over Eleanor. It was real. She wasn't powerless. "Arthur," she began, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I need to tell you everything." He nodded. "Please do. What exactly is happening in that house, Eleanor?" And so, Eleanor recounted it all. The sudden move to the pantry, the sterile white walls, the lack of a window, the constant smell of onions, the systematic removal and discarding of her possessions. The paintings, the quilt, the pottery, the garden, the intentional isolation, the fabricated illnesses to keep her grandchildren away, the chilling conversation she'd overheard, Sophia's casual plan to have her health decline suddenly within a year, to dispose of her. When she mentioned the furniture being sold at the consignment shop, Arthur's expression hardened. "They're selling your personal property without your consent, Eleanor?" he interjected, his voice sharp with professional indignation. "That's not just a breach of trust or poor taste. That's theft, Eleanor. Plain and simple." The word theft resonated deeply, crystallizing the injustice. This wasn't just about disrespect. It was about outright crime. Arthur then leaned forward, his voice taking on a strategic tone. "Eleanor, we need evidence. Photos of your living conditions, recordings of conversations if possible, any witnesses who can attest to your neglect or the disposal of your property." Eleanor left Arthur's office that day with a clear plan, a renewed sense of purpose, and a small, discreet digital recorder that Arthur had provided. She was no longer just enduring. She was fighting back. And this time, she had an army of proof and a formidable lawyer on her side. The morning after her visit to Arthur's office, Eleanor moved with a newfound sense of purpose. A cold, unwavering determination, replacing the fear that had paralyzed her for so long. The small digital recorder Arthur had given her felt heavy, yet empowering, in her hand. First, She meticulously documented her living conditions, taking photos of the cramped pantry room from every angle, capturing the sterile white walls, the windowless expanse, the harsh fluorescent light, and her single twin bed. Each click of the camera was a silent testament to her mistreatment. Next, with Beatrice by her side, Eleanor returned to the consignment shop. Beatrice, ever the practical ally, encouraged her, offering both moral support and an extra set of eyes to ensure every one of Eleanor's cherished pieces was photographed, its price tag clearly visible. "You should have done this months ago, Eleanor," Beatrice remarked, her voice gentle, yet firm. Eleanor nodded, a pang of regret in her chest. "I know," she admitted, her voice soft. I kept hoping Daniel would intervene, that he would see what was happening." The admission was painful, a recognition of her own naive hope, now shattered beyond repair. That evening, a tense silence settled over the house as Daniel and Sophia retreated upstairs. Eleanor, feigning sleep, waited until she heard their bedroom door click shut. Then, with a deep breath, she retrieved the digital recorder from beneath her pillow. The voices, muffled but clear, carried through the old house's ventilation system, directly into her small room. She pressed record. Daniel's voice, laced with concern, was the first she heard. "Sophia, these renovation costs are getting out of hand. The credit card statement this month was astronomical. Are we sure we need to do all this?" Sophia's response was sharp, dismissive. "Daniel, don't be ridiculous. The realtor explicitly said the main bathroom needs to be updated if we want top dollar for this place. We're investing in our future, remember?" Eleanor froze, the word realtor echoing in her mind. A cold wave of dread washed over her. "Top dollar for this place?" Sophia continued, her voice gaining an almost giddy excitement. "Honestly, Daniel, this was never our forever home. You know that. It's just too old. Too much work. Once we sell this, we can finally build exactly what we want. Something modern, low maintenance, in a better school district." Eleanor's grip on the recorder tightened. The house. Her home. They were planning to sell it. The betrayal was staggering, a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about moving her to a pantry. It was about erasing her entirely. Selling off her entire life. Daniel's voice, quieter now, tinged with a faint unease, finally asked the question Eleanor had been dreading, but what about Mom? Sophia's reply was chillingly clinical, delivered with an almost detached efficiency. "Golden Sunset Acres has an excellent reputation, Daniel. It's an assisted living facility. They have a wonderful activities program, and the medical staff are top-notch. It's perfect for her stage of life. She'll be safe there, well cared for, but she gave us this house because we promised to take care of her." Daniel protested, a flicker of his old conscience breaking through. "Daniel, be realistic," Sophia scoffed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "We're not equipped for this. I'm not a nurse. We have 2 children to raise. We can't be held hostage by a promise made years ago to a woman who is clearly declining." Eleanor was horrified, her body shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Their calculated plan was laid bare. Sell her home, then institutionalize her, all under the guise of care. She was not just a burden, she was a variable to be dealt with, an obstacle to their grander plans. She forced herself to breathe, to remain still, keeping the recorder on. Sophia continued, outlining their timeline with unnerving precision. "We'll list the house in the spring. Move in early summer, and we'll get Eleanor settled into Golden Sunset Acres before our Europe trip. Everything will be seamless." Then, a new, even more insidious detail emerged. "Dr. Monroe already thinks she needs more care than we can provide at home," Sophia stated casually. Daniel sounded genuinely surprised. "Dr. Monroe? Mom hasn't seen him in over a year." Sophia's voice was smooth, practiced. "I've been speaking with him. keeping him updated on her condition. I've told him she forgets things, gets confused, sometimes wanders. He agrees a cognitive assessment is in order, just to establish a baseline for her future care needs. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Forgets things, gets confused, wanders. Sophia was deliberately fabricating a narrative of mental decline, laying the groundwork to have her declared incompetent. If that happened, Sophia could gain control of her remaining finances, sign the papers for the assisted living facility, and sell the house without any legal challenge. It was a complete, systematic takeover of her life, her autonomy. She turned off the recorder, her hand trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The small device held the damning evidence, the proof of their betrayal, their theft, and their calculated plan to erase her entirely. The next morning, driven by a surge of panic and a cold certainty, Eleanor carefully examined her mail. Tucked amidst junk flyers, she found a bank statement. A quick glance confirmed her worst fears. Several unauthorized withdrawals from her dwindling savings account. Further digging through a stack of unopened mail revealed multiple unrequested address change notifications from various financial institutions. They had been intercepting her mail, diverting it, and systematically siphoning off her money. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The pantry, the discarded belongings, the isolation, the overheard conversation, the plan to sell her home, the fabrication of her mental decline, and now the financial exploitation. It wasn't just neglect. It was a full-blown, calculated scheme to strip her of everything she possessed, including her dignity and her very identity. Eleanor sat on her small twin bed, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her. The tears that had come so easily before were gone, replaced by a steely resolve. No one was coming to save her. Daniel, her son, was complicit, lost to Sophia's manipulations. The Grey Rebellion had shown her solidarity. Arthur had given her the tools. But ultimately, this fight was hers alone. I would have to save myself. Sophia, with her usual flair for social climbing, had planned an elaborate dinner party. It was for Daniel's colleagues from the law firm, particularly for Edward Hayes, a senior partner whose influence could significantly advance Daniel's career. The entire house was abuzz with caterers, florists, and the frantic energy Sophia exuded whenever she hosted. She was entirely oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in the pantry, unaware that Eleanor's new resolve was about to unleash a very public reckoning. Earlier that afternoon, Sophia had swept into Eleanor's small room, a forced smile on her face. "Mom." She'd begun, her voice betraying a hint of thinly veiled irritation. "Tonight is very important for Daniel's career. We need to make a good impression. So, it would be best if you remained in your room. We'll have the caterer bring you a plate." The implication was clear. Eleanor was a liability, an embarrassment to be hidden away. Eleanor, however, merely offered a polite, serene smile. "Of course, dear," she replied, her voice sounding perfectly compliant. "Whatever Daniel needs." Sophia, satisfied, gave a curt nod and bustled out, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and her plan. After Sophia had departed, Eleanor rose from her bed, a strange calm settling over her. She took out the navy blue silk dress she had worn to William's retirement dinner, a classic piece that still fit perfectly. Then, she clasped William's pearl necklace around her throat, the cool, smooth pearls a comforting weight against her skin. She carefully brushed her silver hair, applying a touch of lipstick. Looking in the small mirror propped on her stool, she saw not the frightened, fading woman of months past, but a woman with purpose. A woman who absolutely refused to be erased. She had gathered her evidence, consulted her lawyer, and now it was time for the world, or at least Daniel's colleagues, to see the truth. At precisely 7 p.m., the house was a symphony of polite chatter, clinking glasses, and soft jazz music. Eleanor heard Sophia's bright, confident voice, drifting from the living room, regaling guests with tales of the extensive renovations they had undertaken. Eleanor smiled grimly. Extensive, indeed. A man's voice, deep and resonant, cut through the conversation. So, Daniel, how long have you two owned this beautiful home? Daniel's reply was hesitant, a faint discomfort in his tone. Oh, about 6 months now. It was my mother's house before. Then a woman's voice, warm and seemingly innocent, chimed in. Oh, how lovely. And where is she now? There, Eleanor thought. The perfect cue. With a quiet, almost imperceptible push, Eleanor opened the pantry door. She walked calmly, deliberately, into the grand living room she had once called her own. The room, now transformed into Sophia's modern aesthetic, felt cold and unfamiliar. Yet Eleanor moved through it with the effortless grace of a hostess. She surveyed the small gathering, a serene smile gracing her lips. Good evening, everyone, she announced, her voice clear and surprisingly strong, carrying over the hum of conversation. Silence descended like a shroud. The music seemed to die. Every head in the room turned towards her, eyes wide with surprise, then confusion. Sophia froze, a half-eaten canapé poised near her lips, her face contorting into a mask of pure shock and incandescent fury. Daniel, at her side, looked as if he'd seen a ghost, his face pale, his jaw slack. Ignoring them both, Eleanor walked directly towards the senior partner, Edward Hayes, a distinguished man with shrewd, intelligent eyes. She extended her hand. Eleanor Vance. She introduced herself warmly, her grip firm. Daniel's mother. It's so lovely to finally meet you, Mr. Hayes. I've heard so much about you. Edward, clearly thrown off guard but a professional, quickly recovered, shaking her hand. A pleasure, Mrs. Vance. His wife, Victoria Hayes, a graceful woman with an air of quiet sophistication, stepped forward. Oh, Eleanor. How lovely it must be for Daniel and Sophia to have you living with them. Such a wonderful family arrangement. Eleanor's smile widened, a glint of steel in her eyes. It has certainly been an adjustment, Victoria, she replied. Her voice impeccably polite, yet carefully calibrated for impact. Actually, I'm in what used to be the pantry, just off the kitchen. No windows, of course, but the ventilation system is quite efficient. Keeps the air moving. An awkward, deafening silence fell over the room. Forks clattered. Conversation ceased entirely. Sophia looked as if she might spontaneously combust. Daniel looked anywhere but at his mother. Sophia, regaining her composure through sheer force of will, forced a brittle laugh. Oh, Mom, you're being dramatic. It's just a temporary arrangement while we finalize the guest room renovations. Eleanor turned to Sophia, her gaze unwavering. Temporary? My dear, 6 months is quite a long temporary period for a 72-year-old woman with a history of a minor stroke, wouldn't you say? She turned back to the guests, her expression one of innocent inquiry. Perhaps you'd all care for an impromptu tour? I'm sure you'd be fascinated by the ingenious use of space. Before Sophia or Daniel could react, Eleanor began to walk towards the staircase, a magnetic force drawing the stunned guests in her wake. This used to be quite a traditional home, you see, she narrated, her voice clear and steady as she ascended the stairs. Full of character, handcrafted furniture, family quilts, paintings by local artists. My son and daughter-in-law have certainly put their own stamp on it. She led them past the now sparse guest rooms, pointing out where a particular heirloom had once stood, a framed photo, a familiar vase. Finally, she reached her former master bedroom, now Sophia's pristine, minimalist sanctuary. She opened the expansive walk-in closet door. And this, she announced, a wry smile playing on her lips, used to be my closet. Much larger, you'll note, than the converted pantry downstairs. Downstairs, Sophia, her face a mask of scarlet fury, finally found her voice. She grabbed Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. What do you think you're doing, you old hag? She hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but vibrating with venom. You're embarrassing, Daniel. Eleanor, now descending the stairs, met Sophia's enraged gaze without flinching. Her voice was calm, almost serene, yet it carried the weight of months of silent suffering, now finally released. "No, Sophia," she retorted, her eyes unwavering. "For the first time in months, I'm not embarrassed at all." Eleanor, having made her dramatic entrance and delivered her initial truths, maintained an extraordinary level of grace and charm throughout the remainder of the dinner party. With a calm demeanor and a gentle smile, she deftly redirected conversations, engaging guests with anecdotes about the house's history, tales of William, and even light-hearted stories about her art-teaching days. She became, to Sophia's utter fury, the undisputed center of attention, a vibrant, eloquent woman who commanded respect, not pity. Daniel, initially shocked, found his expression slowly shifting from embarrassment to a deep, profound shame. He watched his mother, this woman he had allowed to be diminished, now shining brighter than anyone in the room. Sophia, on the other hand, seethed, her perfectly curated evening crumbling around her, her meticulously constructed image shattered beyond repair. She retreated to the kitchen, feigning concern with the caterers, her furious whispers carried on the air, unheard by Eleanor. As the guests began to depart, the air still thick with unspoken questions and simmering tension, Victoria Hayes approached Eleanor, her expression warm and sympathetic. "Eleanor," she said, taking Eleanor's hand in hers, "I would absolutely love for you to join me for lunch next week. There's a wonderful little bistro downtown I think you'd adore." It was a clear, unambiguous gesture of support, a quiet rebellion against Sophia's attempt to isolate Eleanor. Eleanor accepted with a genuine smile, a spark of camaraderie passing between them. Finally, the last car pulled out of the driveway, leaving only the oppressive silence and the three of them. Sophia spun around, her face contorted with rage, her voice a raw, unhinged hiss. "How dare you, you manipulative old woman? You've ruined everything." Eleanor, however, was no longer meek. She stood her ground, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "What exactly have I ruined?" "Sophia," she asked, her voice calm, almost dangerously so. "Your image? Your meticulously crafted facade of generosity? Or perhaps your plans to ship me off to Golden Sunset Acres while you sell my house out from under me?" Sophia's face drained of all color, turning a ghastly white. The casual cruelty she had so easily wielded now recoiled upon her. Daniel, clearly stunned by the revelation of Golden Sunset Acres, finally stepped between them, his voice weak. "Mom, that's not." Eleanor cut him off, her gaze piercing through him. "That's exactly what it is, Daniel. And I have recordings. I have bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals. I have photos, emails, and witnesses. And you," she added, her voice laced with disappointment, "you knew enough to be complicit." The next morning, Daniel, looking haggard and sleepless, approached Eleanor's pantry door, his knuckles hesitant against the cheap wood. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper, I want to apologize. I didn't know about all of it. Not the bank statements, not the extent of what Sophia was planning. Eleanor didn't need to speak. She simply handed him a thick envelope. Inside, he found the carefully organized photos of her pantry room, the consignment shop receipts, the damning bank statements with the unauthorized withdrawals highlighted, or printouts of emails Sophia had sent to various institutions, and, finally, a full transcription of the conversation he and Sophia had had upstairs the previous night. The cold, stark evidence laid bare the full extent of the deception. He read, his face growing paler with each document, a slow dawning of horrifying realization. "Mom, I swear." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes tired but firm. "You may not have known every detail, Daniel, but you allowed it. You allowed it by looking the other way. By dismissing my concerns. By letting her reduce me to a burden. Your silence, your inaction, was an active choice." Later, Eleanor faced Sophia, who was still fuming, pacing the renovated living room like a caged animal. Eleanor laid out the evidence again, specifically mentioning the fabricated stories Sophia had fed to Dr. Monroe. "I spoke with Dr. Monroe this morning, Sophia," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He was quite surprised to hear of my cognitive decline. In fact, he found it rather alarming that such claims were made without any actual medical consultation. The lie, exposed, hung between them, a testament to Sophia's malevolence." Then, Eleanor delivered the final blow. "This ends today, Sophia. I am officially invoking the clause in the deed transfer. This house, legally, is mine again." Sophia stared, disbelief warring with a dawning terror. "You can't do that!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's ridiculous! The house is ours!" Eleanor merely offered a small, knowing smile. "It was. But the paperwork was filed yesterday morning. My attorney, Arthur Davies, handled it personally. You may want to check with your own legal counsel, but I assure you, it is quite binding." The mention of Arthur's name, combined with the calm certainty in Eleanor's voice, finally broke Sophia's composure. The fight drained from her, replaced by a cold, calculating fear of legal ramifications. 3 days later, Eleanor sat in Arthur's office, signing the final documents that officially returned the house to her name. Daniel, quiet and subdued, did not contest. Sophia, faced with Arthur's steely resolve and the undeniable evidence, had backed down completely, unwilling to face a legal battle that would expose her fully. That afternoon, Eleanor had the locks changed on her home. She arranged for Daniel and Sophia to retrieve their personal belongings within the week, ensuring that only her own cherished memories would remain. That night, for the first time in months, Eleanor slept in her own bed, in her master suite. The familiar silence, a balm to her soul. The Boston fern thriving on her bedside table. The large, comfortable bed felt like a cloud after the small twin, the moonlight streaming through her windows a glorious, liberating sight. A week later, Daniel returned alone, looking utterly haggard, a shadow of his former self. He stood in the entryway, the house strangely quiet around them. "She's gone, Mom," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Sophia. She left. And I'm trying to figure out who I became." Eleanor looked at her son, a complex mix of sorrow and a faint flicker of hope in her heart. "That's a journey you'll have to make alone, Daniel," she said softly, but with a firm resolve. "But I'm glad you're trying." Months passed. Eleanor, with Beatrice's unwavering support and the camaraderie of the Grey Rebellion, began to reclaim her house and herself. She transformed the cold, sterile spaces, repainting walls in warm, inviting colors, filling them with new, vibrant art commissioned from local artists, and welcoming sunlight back into her home. She reconnected with her grandchildren, setting clear, firm boundaries with Daniel that allowed for a tentative, healthier relationship to slowly mend. The house bloomed anew, a reflection of Eleanor's renewed spirit. Ultimately, Eleanor decided to sell the Victorian, a house now holding too many bittersweet memories. She bought a charming duplex with Beatrice, a new adventure for both of them, a fresh start, surrounded by true friends, with a sense of purpose and peace she hadn't known in years. Eleanor finally found her true home, not in a building, but within herself.